So my name is Emma Johnston. I'm a Professor of Marine Ecology and Ecotoxicology at the University of New South Wales, Director of the Sydney Harbour Research Program for the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. But the important hat for today is as Deputy President or Vice President of Science and Technology Australia. And I'm very happy to be here. I've learnt a lot already this morning, but this afternoon's panel is particularly interesting. This is a group of people who have worked both on the inside of policy development and on the outside of policy influence and have transitioned in both directions. Some would say something like a chameleon. But we are going to be privileged to hear their insights of how they would have worked had they known everything they know now throughout their career, and also some personal stories from various people. Now, before I introduce those speakers, a very important quick bit of housekeeping. Science and Technology Australia runs several different types of events. We always like to make sure that those events are better than the last, and one way we do that is by getting feedback from the participants. So within your blue folder, you'll find a form, a feedback form, and we would really appreciate you taking 5 minutes to fill out that form and handing it in on the way out, and that will ensure that we can make sure the next event is even better than this one. So allow me to just briefly introduce the three speakers and then I'll sit down and keep quiet. I really encourage you to take notes and get questions ready for the speakers, because we will have a substantial amount of time for questions, assuming everyone keeps to time. And we really think that that's a very productive part of today's event. We only have a very short time for afternoon tea. I'm just warning you for that on that basis. So our first speaker will be Professor Aidan Byrne. Many of you will know him, CEO of the Australian Research Council since 2012. He's also been Dean of Science and Director of the ANU College of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, and has a very, very prestigious background. So you can see he's mostly transitioned from academia into government, and that's going to be a really interesting story. I've heard him advocate very clearly on the need for scientists to increase the influence and impact of their research for many different reasons, and I hope he illustrates some of those today. Our second speaker, Rona Mellor, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Agriculture in charge of biosecurity, and we know that biosecurity is an incredibly important issue for agriculture, our economy and our environment, so that's fantastic that she could be here. She also has a very impressive and extensive amount of experience in policy and in public service. She was awarded the Public Service Medal in 2013 for its outstanding public health service in the development and implementation of biosecurity, taxation and health system policies and projects. So Rona has a wealth of policy development and leadership experience. Our final speaker will be Anne-Marie Lansdown. Anne-Marie is Deputy CEO of Universities Australia, so she's very busy at the moment, as you can imagine. She also has extensive public sector service experience, and she has been at very high levels of many important science programs, including as being in charge of NCRIS, which you may realise is a very important issue at the moment and a highly contentious one. Also very much involved in the Education Investment Fund, the Office of the Chief Scientist, the National Broadband Strategy, a huge array of science-related policy issues covered there. So we're very privileged to have these speakers with us today. Hopefully you will have some great questions for them. As I said, I'm going to leave the floor and allow them to take the floor, and I would like you to welcome the first speaker, Aidan Byrne.
Thanks, Emma. Look, it's a privilege to be here, and I was here this morning, and I think everyone's talked about everything I wanted to say, but we heard that this morning too, and I'm not going to sit down. I want to reflect on three of the themes, and I'll talk about another one, but three of the themes that were talked about particularly this morning. It's all about money, it's all about time, and it's all about process. And we did have some wonderful descriptions about all those dimensions this morning, about this interface between the academic research environment and the policy-making environment. I'm new to the policy-making environment. I'm new to government, sort of. And then at the end, maybe I want to make a few comments to inspire, I hope, the young people in the audience to get engaged and get involved, and I'll give you a particular instance of that. I do want to show an overhead, and just one, or one and a half, and it's this one. This is all about the money, right? This is the budget. This is the government's budget, the federal government, and I do apologise for anyone that feels more closely aligned to states. There's another whole map that you can do for the state budgets. They're different. But if we look at the federal budget here, and look at the responsibilities of the federal budget, and if I can get my clicker and work out how to switch it on. So, a lot of expenditure across a lot of different areas. Science, as we heard this morning, around $8-9 billion. Where is it in this diagram? It's there. So a question you should ask, looking at this diagram here, if you're trying to engage with a member of either the public service or indeed the government who's worrying about this, talking about an issue of science, one of the first questions you should ask, really, are they going to care? Because they're going to worry about the big picture, and you're concerned not just about the little bits of red, but the tiny, tiny, tiny part of that bed. And a message that's really very important that, again, was articulated a number of times today, you've got to get much better at the elevator pitch. Much better at walking in to a minister's office, much better at walking in to a public servant's office and telling them why you are engaging with them and what is the importance of that, and not just, I have to say again and again, not just give me more money. We heard that many, many times. The decision makers in the system here get asked for money all the time. The most effective turn-off in any way, trying to influence policy, is just give us some more money. Now, you could argue quite rightly, this is not where science is. Science is actually embedded in all of these things, and the critical issue here is how can you, in your little area, have influence in the broad. And as I say, we've heard a lot about it this morning. The money matters, so it's got to be high enough in priority, and I think we had some very good description about the messiness of the decision-making process. The cycles are complicated. It's not at all clear. It's not transparent by any means at all how decisions are made, and it is about trying to balance, and it is about trying to compromise to come up with, as far as possible, an equitable distribution of resource that's indicated by that diagram, and science has only a small part to play. And one of the things that, if you've been working in academia, as I did for nearly 30 years, it's very difficult to understand the culture that sits outside of academia. The nature, in particular the time scales associated with it. We've had some good examples of it this morning. Emily talked about her projects. That's a 40-year project. Brian talked about his astronomy. Science goes by little stages, and then occasionally Brian comes along, changes the paradigm, a sharp step, and it continues on. That's not the way that I've seen anything work. And I have to say, my window of deeper insight into the political system is relatively short, so maybe in the old days it was better, but I doubt it. But the description of how policy evolves was more like Hugh's. It's a much more dynamic process. In fact, if I had to draw a map of the process, science goes along, adding to knowledge slightly incrementally, occasional steps which improve it. Policy evolution is different. It continues on at a very low level all the time. And then suddenly, a spike, a delta function for the physicists in the audience here. It's a spike of activity where the activity level, the window opens. That was the metaphor used this morning. The window opens and everything gets poured into that. And as was said again this morning a number of times, you have to be ready. Now the challenge here, when you have a process that's like that, massive spike of activity, drops down again, nothing, or nearly nothing, but a lot of stuff goes on in the background, and then another spike, and so on. The problem with that model is you can't predict what's going to happen as a consequence of that massive spike. And that makes the process extraordinarily difficult. right? That makes, the model that you have of how to change the world that you understand as a researcher. Let's focus on the problem for 40 years and we'll get a richer understanding. Totally inappropriate for getting into the minds and convincing the hearts of the people that are either building the policy framework or, more importantly, the people that are charged with the responsibility of making the decisions. And the decisions they have to make is about the allocation of resource for a whole lot of envelopes there that are absolutely critical to running the country. And your little issue is a minor issue. So the key message there, you've got to be succinct. Don't just ask for money. Provide solutions, provide a richer context in a shorter time. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do. It's really difficult. It is much harder than the 3-minute theses competitions that I think are capturing some good momentum in universities. It's actually much harder than that, because even then you're talking to an audience that broadly understands what you're talking about. Now again, all of these issues were talked about in detail this morning. So one of the other things I would like to point out is that I've drawn these envelopes here as separate envelopes. And it's been one of the really interesting things that I've seen, again, contrasting my experience in universities with my experience now as a public servant. And universities get criticised for being ivory towers, get criticised for being isolationist and having hard boundaries. But what I've found very interesting is how various components in the public service actually show a lot of those attributes too. There's a compartmentalisation that exists within the bureaucracy that is sometimes counterproductive to good outcomes. Now, that happens in universities. I've spent half my life in universities trying to break down silos, trying to get people to work together. But if you don't understand the nature of a departmental structure within the public service, you will get nowhere either. And it's worse. It's worse than that. We talked about the timescales of research. Academic research is a 40-year horizon. People think about things for that long. Things change over that long. We had an interesting... There's an illustration of the timescales, which is different from the policy environment to universities. Last week, this institution, major announcement, the Vice-Chancellor's leaving. Right? He's leaving in a year's time. This institution is setting up a process to find its new leader, which is a year long. I remember a case 2 years ago. I went home on a Friday night thinking I'd done a good job. My executive general manager rang me up at 9 o'clock and she said, Aidan, we've got a new boss on Monday. The political process changes leadership. I had my heart in my mouth at the beginning of this week, wondering if I would have a new minister, a new boss on Tuesday. And that was a realistic scenario. I've been in the job a little over 2.5 years. I've had 6 ministers as bosses. Right? Contrast that to the university system, this university that's taking a year to change its Vice-Chancellor. And as I say, it's more complicated than that, because the consequence of a change of leadership, either a change of government or even a minor change of portfolio, is that these envelopes all change. And people that might have been responsible for what you're passionate about move somewhere else. So there's a volatility in the bureaucracy, in the public service, that actually, if you haven't experienced it, if you haven't been intimately connected with it, provides an enormous challenge for you to get a consistent message across. And that was a serious moral of this morning's talks, is that you've got to work at it for a long time. It really is very, very challenging, because literally overnight everything could change, and that's a challenge. Now, the system has evolved to deal with that. The people in the system, I find, are amazingly relaxed about these machinery of government changes. I find it just very mind-blowing to try and deal with. Yet it functions. Yet it provides, in general, really high-quality advice to the members of Parliament, to the decision makers, and it's really an onerous job. it is very difficult to decide and what basis to use for it to give money to social services compared to education to health. These are not scientifically quantifiable allocations. They actually have to be done against some completely different, alien framework to those working in the science community. And unless you try and understand that, you'll get absolutely nowhere. So I want to stop because I do want to leave more time for questions, but I do want to make a comment about encouraging younger people to engage in the broad debate. And my personal experience of this, because before I took on this job, was a commentator on the nuclear debate, interestingly, and I don't want you to ask me about that, but I do want to tell you how I got into it. And I was a member of a Department of Nuclear Physics here at the ANU, and we were having a conversation around the table, and we realised there was no one in the country, literally no one in the country, that was providing separate advice about nuclear science. And we sat around the table and said, well, really, we should make ourselves available to do it. And I said, because I had nothing else to do at the time, I said, well, I don't mind being a go-to person if anyone wants to ask us questions about this particular debate. And I did. And at that point, I have to say, I knew a lot about nuclear physics, but nothing about nuclear power, and they're very different things. But I've now given more talks about nuclear issues than I've given about all my other research activities in my career. But I was prepared to engage in that public discourse. And it involves you going to small groups, talking to them. It involves you going to quite hostile groups sometimes. It's a very contentious issue. But all of the time, I tried, in a personal sense, to give an objective view of the facts about nuclear power. And as I say, it's a very emotive issue. Some of you are probably dealing with that. But all of the time, it's worthwhile. And I really do want to commend the young people in the audience to take that step. There will be pressures on you in an academic environment, pressures from me as the head of the ARC, to get more outputs, get higher quality outputs all the time. But it is really important that you engage with the community. And it is by that engagement, it is about remaining objective, presenting the facts dispassionately, that you do build up something that was articulated this morning that I think is very important. It builds up trust in the community, and people will come back to you for advice, and that's the way to build and have influence. Thanks very much.
Are you right, Rona, if I
I'm good.
Start the timer?
Sure. So I don't know what you heard this morning, and I'm hoping that I'm not going to travel over some territory and bore you because you've just had lunch. I guess the one message I want to leave behind today is that in the policy and regulatory world, science can't sit alone. And what I'm going to do is take you inside my organisation, the Department of Agriculture, and particularly into the biosecurity sciences side of that world. And now that I know I'm being filmed, I will protect the innocent. For me, I'm an odd person to be standing here because most of my career has been as a tax lawyer, including in a minister's office advising government. And I then spent some time in the Medicare Australia working on all sorts of interesting things there, and I worked very closely with doctors and pharmacists, both as staff and as stakeholders, so I got to see some contesting of ideas emerging in that sense. When I turned up to the Department of Agriculture in 2010, I thought, you beauty, it's regulatory. What I didn't understand was hidden in there was all these scientists. And on my first day, I'd sort of moved into the new room, unpacked my personal effects, my coffee cup, and this person ran into my office and said to me, "You need to do a 74D. And I thought, oh my God, what is that? And they explained to me that there was a cargo ship on its way from New Zealand, and it was absolutely infested with these things called burnt pine longicorn beetles. Now, I couldn't even say that 5 years ago. I had no idea what they were, and of course, as a lawyer, the first thing I did was flick through the law and look for this thing called a 74D. But I actually needed to have standing near me some scientific experts to explain to me not only what these things were, but why they were a problem to Australia. I'm just thinking beetles, Christmas beetles, apparently these things can denude a forest overnight. So we don't want them here. And I'm also a regulator, and so I know there's a master of a vessel from a very large shipping company who isn't intending to bring beetles to the country, and from what I'm being told by our staff, he's doing his utmost to deal with the infestation, but he's failing. And so he's doing the right thing from a compliance perspective, ringing us up and saying, can I enter, And of course, if he crosses into Australian territorial waters, then I have to make a decision. So my call was, let's get him to turn before he gets here and I don't have to do anything. And fortunately for us, he did. And well, for me, I'm day one. And not only that, it's brought home to me not only where science and regulation fitted in the department, but also the international relationships. We needed to deal with the New Zealand government who had, gifted us these beetles through the ship and make sure that they were re-gifted back. Some of my people weren't very happy with me when I was pondering and weighing up what should we do, because to them it was clear we are not having these beetles here, they should go. But they weren't thinking necessarily about all the impacts of that decision that it had on the relationship with New Zealand, the relationship with the shipping company, the relationships with importers who were waiting for the actual cargo on the ship, and therefore what was the steps that you had to go through. As far as they were concerned, it's science and that's what you have to do. Well, the next week, then I learnt how powerful they were in the department, because a group of them sent an email to my secretary to tell my secretary that I was the wrong person for the job. Yeah. I was a wee bit shocked because this hadn't happened anywhere else before, because if you're a tax lawyer in the tax office, you're kind of like one of them. And if you're a good regulator in Medicare, you're kind of like one of them. But if you're not a scientist in biosecurity, whoa. And it was a difficult decision for my secretary to actually show me the email, but I'm glad that he did, because what it did for me was open some dialogue with the scientists in the department. In fact, I asked them to come up. It was rather uncomfortable. But it was a good opportunity for me to listen to them about where did they think science fitted into the evidence base and the decision making within the department. And this was a department, of course, that had been through a terrible, terrible experience with equine influenza in Australia. There'd been a royal commission, people had been hauled in front of the commission, people had disappeared, lost their jobs, whatever. There was, sort of really, really difficult relationships with industry, the science community and the department. So I can understand how they wanted one of theirs to be in charge. I hope they think that they're lucky that they've got me now. I've lasted 5 years, so... The thing about the department is that it is a very large employer of scientists. So I think I'm the largest employer of vets in Australia, with over 200. And they work in all sorts of different scientific scenarios. I have epidemiologists, I have on-plant vets in meatworks, I have people that check herds and muster, I have people that take serology from sentinel herds in the north of Australia. So if you're a vet, it's a fantastic place to work because there's so much variety as opposed to, say, small private practice or academia, and we actually have quite a circulation of vets coming through. There's only about 4,500 people in the department, and 20% of them have qualifications, experience or training in science. So agricultural sciences, plant scientists we're big on. We like botanists and biologists and pathologists. We have food sciences, chemists, forestry and marine scientists, and people that know soil, which kind of makes sense in agriculture. The tricky bit when you're leading scientists is to actually give them the right voice. I think it goes to a previous point about, what's the evidentiary point that they can bring, particularly when they understand that other people are bringing a voice as well. So me as a regulator or a lawyer, I'm saying, well, hang on a sec, what you're going to do could be illegal, And so they think that policy thinkers and regulators don't get them, don't understand the time taken for good science, research, peer review, publishing, ethics committees, and they think that policy people are only in there for a minute. They don't have deep experience, they're in and out, the windows open and close. They don't think that people understand when black and white answers are required and when you can actually have hypotheses. I've seen plenty of experiences, even in front of ministers, where that arm of government is looking for a black and white answer and the science answer is not. And I've seen very, very accomplished people being pushed towards a black and white and holding firm in their professionalism about scenarios and consequences and risks. But I've also seen it the other way, where people can get pushed to black and white because that's what they want. One of the things I'm trying to do with our science cohort is teach them about how to present their evidence in different places, because it can get very tricky. And we've got great scientists also outside of biosecurity, although we think we're the best, in ABARES and you know, places like that within the department, who do awesome longitudinal work as well and keep an eye on all sorts of things. The tricky bit for my people is that they do have to appreciate that when you work in government, you do a certain kind of job. And if people don't buy your answer, you can't go out and publicly talk about it. Some of them used to think that they could. You know, if the government made a decision and they didn't like it, they thought that they were entitled to hop on the email and have a view. No, you have to think of where your bread and butter comes from first, and if you don't like that, you might have to think somewhere else. So it's a little less free than some of their experiences in other places. That's a bit hard for them, and they also do still struggle with how much to go for. Let me just give you an example about this. Has anyone heard of myrtle rust? Yeah? Myrtle rust is a pretty horrible thing. And a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago, I think, it was found in New South Wales in a nursery. And, you know, it was a nursery, and obviously nursery people know their stuff, and they see this very limey green fungus on these plants, and they do the right thing, and they ring New South Wales Biosecurity. And when we in Biosecurity hear rusts, all sorts of rusts, we kind of go into meltdown because they are so devastating and hard to eradicate because of how they move. They just move. But New South Wales got on the job quickly and started tracing movements of product between nurseries, and suddenly it went from 1 to 50. And suddenly it went up and up and up. And what was interesting is that we had science people looking at the sort of pathways, which were largely mechanical, but also the climatic pathways. The warmer it got up the east coast of Australia, the more emerged. And obviously the more people you throw out to look for it, the more you find. And suddenly it became a national issue because Queensland doesn't want myrtle rust from New South Wales, thanks very much. And Victoria certainly doesn't want it either, thanks very much. And the Western Australians are sitting there going, beauty, the nullarbor. And so within each state, they're putting in all of these regulatory controls, quarantine areas, you can't move this, you can't do that. We've put on sort of import barriers. We had started from our end in the Commonwealth taking sticky tape samples of people coming through the border, because what everybody wants in biosecurity is to blame someone. How did it get here? Well, I don't know. Most of the time, if you can't trace it to a particular import, I don't know. And what we found when we actually did the analysis of what people were bringing on their clothes through the airport is that we thought that the safest way was to have everyone come through naked, and that was never going to win. Because people are carrying all sorts of stuff. Its risk of entry into our environment is quite low, but they're carrying stuff. So in the meantime, there was a great debate going on because we don't have big rust specialists here in Australia because we don't have it. And so we asked CSIRO to start to do some genetic testing for us because there was a big argument amongst scientists as was it eucalyptus rust or guava rust or myrtle rust. We was given a name, myrtle rust, because it was on the Myrtaceous species. This is a big deal for us in Australia because we put trade restrictions on other countries around eucalyptus rust and guava rust. And so we actually need to make sure that if we've got something, we know what it is. But of course, CSIRO, with all of its greatness, needs the time to work through that identification process. And the decision makers are saying, we want to know what it is because we have to do all these things. Well, when it was found in a forest on the Somersby Plateau, way up in the new growth of a tree, we knew we were in trouble because all of the fungicides in the world were not going to reach forests. The other interesting thing for us in all of that was that the forest industry had already thought about what if rust gets here. So they weren't actually that worried about it because they already had a whole range of research and development underway in anticipation of the change in conditions in Australia. Nonetheless, a decision had to be made at some point through all Australian governments coming together and a variety of industries to decide whether we would continue to pour millions and millions of dollars into eradication. And the answer was no. The best that we could do was look for containment strategies in particular areas and change the regulation about the movement of certain goods and the importation of certain goods. Now, even within my own department, very, very, very astute scientists had difficulty with that decision, because they know that if you pour as much fungicide as you can on something, eventually you will kill it. Farmers couldn't buy that much fungicide. It couldn't be applied up in the trees. And so an internal debate then occurred about the eradication policy versus what the science can tell you. And the difficulty is that pure science thinking and regulatory thinking were having a difficulty in harmonising. And it still does. Does anyone read the Northern Territory News? It's always got the best front page. So this morning's front page story that was of interest to me was this woman there's this thing called banana freckle. Plant diseases always have the best names. Banana freckle makes the bananas freckly. It's another fungus. And last year, what we found out is that Cavendish bananas were as susceptible to ladyfinger bananas. Imagine a tax lawyer knowing this. It kind of blows you away. But I hear banana freckle and I go, I'd buy freckly bananas. But of course what it does is it diminishes the productivity of the plant, and therefore the farmer pays more money to keep the productivity high. So biosecurity is pretty important. Well, there's this woman up there, so the banana freckle's running madly through the Northern Territory, and of course most of the banana industry in Australia is in Queensland. It's worth, 700 million-ish a year, and then there's a bit in Western Australia and a little bit in the north of New South Wales. Nobody wants banana freckle in the big commercial plantations because of two things. One is the cost of the production, and the second thing is that no bananas come into Australia from other countries because we've got freedom from a whole bunch of diseases, including banana freckle and black sigatoka, etc. As soon as we've got banana freckle, another banana grower's going to go, hoo-hoo, another country's going to go, can we bring our bananas in? And then I'll be in Parliament getting caned. So this woman has decided, the scientist, the best scientific advice in Australia says the only way you can get rid of banana freckle is to get rid of banana plants. And in the north, it's pretty common sense, because you can spray them, but it's going to cost you lots of money. It's not 100% effective, but it also affects the soil. So the plantations need to lay fallow, and they've got some, Israeli independent scientist who says 3 months. He's never been to Australia and actually lived through a wet summer. And then the normal sort of biosecurity standard is up to 2 years. So there's a debate going on about fallow at the moment. And this woman, who has banana trees in her yard, has locked her gates and isn't going to let anyone in to take out her banana trees. Think about it. If someone came to our backyards and said, we're taking out your apple tree, we might get a bit thingy. But she's determined. She's calling it a Gandhian response to biosecurity science. And I sat there and I thought to myself, would she actually listen to a scientist? No, I don't care about your banana freckle. I don't care about Queensland bananas. So I want my bananas. And I thought about, will the regulators, with the powers, they can cut the fence, they can go in at night and sneak out a banana tree. Will they do that? Probably not. What will the politicians do? I was sort of interested to see whether it got a run in question time in the Northern Territory today. It will. There's nothing else. Bananas, they're big business. But what if you asked the rest of the country, do we want banana freckle here? And the scientists say you can get rid of it by doing this. I reckon most people would go at sort of a country level, yeah, you should get rid of it. I don't hold that much hope for her, but she'll move to page 3 and I'll keep watching her. The scientist's voice in that scenario is not going to be the loudest one. And teaching our scientists actually how to pitch their information, knowing those consequences, is quite high. I'll just give you one more Darwin example, because it did make the front page in 1999 and just before I was in biosecurity, but I just think about the other influences there. In 1999, the port of Darwin, which for those of you who know it is quite small but is on expansion horizons at the moment with all the development in the north, was infested with this horrible thing called the black striped mussel. Now I'm sure they're nice to eat, but apparently they can clog up industry, ruin ecosystems, ruin our biodiversity, and they had to be killed. And in 1999, the scientific advice was get rid of them, and these are the treatments that you can use. Chlorine. And basically, the harbour was closed off and chlorinated. Now think about that, 1999, do you reckon that would happen today? The different voices that play out through politics, science and community would be quite different. And so one of the things that I have to keep asking our science to do is think about the science, which is important and what we want you for, but think about where it lands and actually understand where it's going to land, and you'll be able to pitch your case a bit better. I think the tricky thing for them is this keeping contemporaneous, keeping focused and keeping on the ball in that landing space. When that one window opens, they need to be ready with the good evidence and with the story that goes with it. Convincing a minister, convincing someone like me who has to make an investment decision on chlorinating a harbour or wiping out bananas in the Northern Territory needs to be convincing, but also understanding the risks, will it work, and is it worth funding? And I'm confident that within the department, people are growing like that. The people that we work with as stakeholders, as scientists, say with industry groups like AusVeg and Cattle Council, we actually have to take them along on that journey because they're the ones that are looking for money, knocking on doors and looking for money. So we have to take them along. The biggest issue for us is not to politicise it. You won't win this debate with this side or that side. It's actually the story around it. I'm confident. It's a long way. It's a long journey. We do some long-term things in the public service. I'm confident that the science capability in the public service is growing that way, not politicised, but understanding where their science lands. Thank you.
So when Katrina rang me and asked if I'd give a presentation at this forum, I said, well, I've done this before, Katrina, what have I got to say? And she said, yes, but you're on the other side now. And I thought, no, I don't feel like I'm on the other side. I'm actually in the middle. So I was in government for a very long time. The science community were our stakeholders for most of that time. But I think the translators or the intermediaries are in a really interesting position at the moment in this environment. So I work for Universities Australia, and you'd be amazed at how many people don't know what that is. But we represent Australia's 39 public universities. There are a number of subgroups that you've probably heard of, the Group of 8, the ATN, the IRU run, but we have to manage the interests of all 39, which, as you can imagine, is our first problem. And I have to say it's a pleasure not to be talking about the higher education reforms this afternoon. So what do? We're the voice of the sector, basically. We have to be an important voice to both policymakers and to politicians, but also back to our stakeholders. How do we do it? Well, the organisation is made up of people that have come from all those places. So you can't understand the context of any of those people if you haven't had some experience in there. And we have ex-academics or academics who I presume will go back to academia at some stage, ex-policy makers and a whole range of other people, including media people, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So we have to be the translators. I'm sure many of these things have been said this morning, so I'll flick through it very, very quickly. But there's no doubt that if you look at the sorts of challenges that government's having to look at now, scientific inputs are desperately important, but they're scientific inputs that cross so many different disciplines and so many different economic interests. It is actually helpful to have some sort of translators in the system. So, when I last spoke at this forum, which was probably 3 years ago, the APS 200 project was in play, and I think it's kind of disappeared from the horizon, but there was an awful lot of fairly helpful guidance in that process that talked about how we might engage a little bit better. But obviously we're looking at the right evidence at the right time and the right people, and that's exactly what Rona's talking about. She needs somebody to tell her really, really quickly what the percentages are, and then you have to understand her context as you're giving her that advice. So there's a whole range of challenges and opportunities for ensuring that science gets better integrated into policy formulation. So the identification of the issues is really important, and researchers often have quite a good idea about emerging issues, but they don't know how to get that message into, for example, various departments that are dealing with those problems. So the connections have to be there before the issue emerges. If there hasn't been a level of trust developed, somebody lobbing in and saying, we've got a really terrible problem, but if the department's never heard of you before, there's kind of a little bit of negotiating has to go on before you get the attention that you need. In terms of policy analysis, there's often a disconnect between the questions that policymakers are asking and actually the advice they need. Sometimes they need a bit of help in framing those questions in terms of getting the right sort of input, and the sorts of things that we would suggest are things like multidisciplinary task force and advice about how to procure scientific advice. A portfolio that has their scientific advice for the most part on the inside is a long way ahead in these stakes than departments that are actually looking for essentially advice from a constituency that isn't part of their own domain. Enhancing access to research data and long-term data sets is something that is desperately important, and I'm sure it has been mentioned this morning. If you are trying to undertake policy analysis, if you suddenly find that the ABS collection that you were kind of counting on is no longer being collected, some of the long-term health data statistics that have been collected in government previously, the NCRIS facilities collect long-term data that's used for weather forecasting, crop planting, all sorts of things, and people don't actually realise where that data is coming from. So there's a real issue about it being funded in the longer term. Consulting with stakeholders. I think government's getting better at consulting with stakeholders. Let's not talk about in specific governments, but I think people understand that the best policies are generally made in consultation with your stakeholders. In my experience, the stakeholders are often better at coming up with ideas for the solutions to your problems than the ones that you can come up with in private. Nothing more certain than you will miss something, you will have unintended consequences in a policy if you haven't actually asked the stakeholders. There is an issue about education on both sides about the scientific process, and I think that's been discussed a little bit already. The media portrays many of these issues as absolutely binary, black or white. It doesn't matter that 95% of the evidence on a particular issue might fall down on one side. They report it in an equal way, which gives the community in an accurate perception about where the weight of scientific evidence is. The other issue is one that Rona alluded to about giving advice to policymakers in a way that they understand scientific method. So very rarely will a scientist say to you, I'm 100% sure of something, and if they are 100% sure of something, you should be really worried because, there aren't many things that you're 100% sure about. So when they say, well, we're 5% uncertain, and Ian Chubb may have used this analogy this morning, he frequently says, if you had a 95% chance of being hit by a car when you walked across the road, you would not be comforted by that 5%. You would choose not to walk across the road. But that is very much an issue about how you present this evidence to policymakers. Implementation's a really interesting thing as well. It's very helpful, I think, to include scientists in your implementation processes. The one thing I would say is that often people who have deep vested interest and fantastic background in these issues don't understand the constraints that people like Rona might be dealing with in making a decision. So, Aidan talks about the money. Rona talks about the political fallout. It's not that the policymakers are stupid. It's that they have a whole lot of balls they have to balance and come down on some decision which is not going to make everybody happy. Evaluation is also really helpful. So we really need good scientific data collection, but it would be helpful to have science involved in the evaluations of some of our programs, and I'm talking about all sorts of science. I'm skipping through some of this because you've heard it all before. But what do we think the role of intermediaries are? And I think intermediaries in the current environment can actually be particularly useful. So I will use the example of NCRIS partly because it's very dear to my heart, but because it's an interesting case study in how you get your messages through to politicians and government. So you do have to have an in-depth understanding of the policy environment if you want to have your voice heard. Now, it's not possible for all scientists to have that understanding, but an intermediary can say to you the sorts of things that Aidan said. Look at the budget. Be realistic about what's possible. We have to build strong relationships with policymakers. We've spent the last 3 days at Parliament House with ministers and crossbenchers. We get in the door because of the organisation that we represent or the constituency that we represent. But you do have to be a trusted friend. So it's important that you understand who can get in and carry your message to policymakers. We have to work with our community to help them facilitate their interactions. So one of the things that's been really helpful in working on the NCRIS program for a decade, there's a lot of amazing science being done in our facilities, and there's some absolutely brilliant people in those facilities. But we have to get the message through about why policymakers or politicians should care. So there's a range of things you have to be able to do really quickly, and as I say, media training helps. Because if you go through a media training, they say, what is your message? What is it you are trying to tell me? We've heard that I want more money is not a good place to start. So how do you make politicians care? They do need facts. So in the NCRIS program context, $9 billion on science, research and innovation. How much money does it take to fund the infrastructure to make that possible? Probably about 2%. So that's something that a politician hears and listens to. They care about the fact that industry is involved in about 25% of our facilities because they're very focused on economic growth, they're very focused on university industry engagement. So while there are many fantastic things we could say, we have to think, what are the things that are actually going to make them listen? We have, and so obviously a value of the media presence is important. A media presence is a positive and a negative thing. The fact that anybody can have their voice heard in any range of forums at the moment makes actually managing the prosecution of an issue quite difficult. So you can imagine suggesting to 39 Vice-Chancellors it would be very helpful if none of them put a good idea in the media while we're prosecuting a very specific case is fairly difficult. But similarly, it's not helpful, for example, for facilities in the NCRIS program to go out and say, isn't the government stupid? Don't they understand that, 1,500 people are going to lose their jobs and all these things? And it's the truth, but it's not helpful. No government likes being criticised in the media. Far better to be able to tell them what they have and help them to understand how much value it has to them. So we have a range of mechanisms that we can use in UA to collect information and get messages back into the policy-making processes. So we have meetings regularly, obviously, with our plenary, but the Deputy Vice-Chancellor's research can give us advice and do on any scientific issue that the government is interested in at very short notice. To give you an example, we got something through from CASA the week before Christmas. The week before Christmas was very special. We got, 15 different processes that needed to be circulated in the universities by the end of January. They came from different portfolios everywhere. But one of them was about the use of drones. And we thought, oh God, do the universities use drones? Of course they do. Of course they do. But we can go out straight away to the executive and say, These are the new regulations that are being proposed. How does it affect you? Much larger issues like defence trade controls, changes to the rules in the NH and MRC, dear heavens above, changes to Aidan's rules. Aidan comes regularly to be beaten up at TVCRs. So we have many mechanisms, but the value that we add, and this isn't an advertisement for UA, but the value that we can add is we can synthesise the message and contextualise it and put it to government in a way that is most likely to be heard. So how are we bridging the gap? I think we're making fairly slow progress, I think. So, ANIP, the Australian National, what do we call it again? Institute for Public Policy. Great forum for bringing scientists, researchers and policymakers together. But there's a number of those types of institutes around the country. But I think the integration of individuals into advisory boards, consultation processes and all those sorts of things is probably the best way. Collaborative structures like the CRC program. So we're making some progress, and I think the scientific community is getting much more sophisticated in having its message heard, and I think the policy makers are getting much more reasonable about what expectations they have of science in terms of short-term advice and easy answers and all the problems that we've identified. Thank you.
I think you'll all agree that that was 3 fantastic talks, somewhat scary, but all with an emphasis on the need for rapid response. And that last talk I thought was particularly good because it identified a means by which we can engage and have that capacity via better communications and networks of scientists that work together, which is what the STA is all about as well, which is great. So we have some time for questions. If you'd like to indicate, there are microphones that are going to be sent around the room. We have one at the back here. There's another microphone here. If anyone on my right would like to ask a question, just indicate.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and great sessions. I'm Mark Robertson from Wiley, the publisher in education and research. And I'm just wondering, looking at Aidan's chart there of all the parts of government, science tends to get moved around. Sometimes it's with education, sometimes it's with industry. I think one Australian government even had it on its own at one stage. And I'm just wondering if the panel has any comments as, does it really matter where science is in the big scheme of things?
Definitely, is that on? Yep. Definitely done to push the ball to me first. Yes and no is the answer to that one, Mark. It sort of does. The problem, not the problem in a way, the diagram I showed did illustrate that everywhere, or not everywhere, but there are a whole lot of activities in government that's related to science. I think it's a mistake to assume that all of science is ever going to be compartmentalised in one department, and I actually would think, that approach is the wrong one. What you have to have, I think, is a system that is much more sensitive to the fact that science is actually going to impinge on a lot of parts of government in different ways, and having a system able to respond to that. And the notion that, it's a catastrophe because, there isn't one department that's only concerned with science is actually missing the point of how science influences all parts of government. And I think your department's an absolutely classic one there.
And we weren't an envelope one.
No, you weren't even in that one. That's right, exactly. And that's exactly the point. Yet, totally reliant on high quality science. So I think it's a false statement to think that the right thing to do is to ever put it into a single department. And then you can have an argument all the time about, is it better sitting with education or is it better sitting with industry? The right answer is what it is now is the right situation, of course.
Stephen Horn, I'm a statistician. Maybe just following on from that, maybe it's not about science in government, it's about scientists in government, and whether they're recognised in terms of them as scientists, as distinct from public servants, and how is this uneasiness about what are they free to do, or how do their opinions count when it's internal advice rather than external advice. And I think that I think it was Anne-Marie talking about Rona talking about the purchasing of advice by governments, which actually has a distorting effect on the whole of the research enterprise. Maybe it's not seen that way, but I've seen it in operation. There is a question about how you keep integrity within that process, and whether it's more cost effective for government to recruit scientists, so it has in-house, and maybe become more science literate within itself, so that it can actually talk to the research community. I'll leave it at that.
It's a really vexed issue from me, because I say, where's your bread butter, you know? To the scientists, we have some pretty good rules in our department, at least, because we also have ABARES, the Australian Bureau of Agricultural Research, Economics and Science, and a lot of the people who go to work there come out of academia and go back into it. So there's quite a lot of interchange between two sectors in the public economy. And we have some rules about when can they publish with their own name versus under the brand. But we always recognise individual effort in research work within the publication. It's different on the operational side. So I've got operational scientists who are in laboratories all day. They actually are not seeking vast recognition. They see their world and they're in identification and treatment and internal advice, as you called it. The trick for us is to find people that can do both or more than those two kinds of things. And the research agenda is one that's not being heavily internally funded now, partly because the research agenda that we bring in our portfolio to the table is one that people are seeking from other sectors. And so ABARES is actually quite small now compared to people who've known its 70-year anniversary this year. It used to be run by, you know, multi-mega high-level people, and there was heaps of them, and it's not anymore. And it's quite selectively funded for certain inputs, because it's contestable. There are other inputs. The point made about where is data and where's it stored and how it's gathered is a current issue for us. Whether it's climate data, whether it's weather data, soil moisture data, etc., because we provide advice to the government on what to invest in productivity. Finding the people who can get that balance right, being internal, is tricky. Mostly they get it. Occasionally you get somebody who wants to be an expert outside as well as inside. I know CSIRO has the same issue. Joanna and I have had long conversations about how to guide people well, but mostly it's okay.
We have some more questions, but would anyone else like to respond? No? Okay, I'll go to here, and then we have some questions.
Aidan Byrne from the Australian National Data Service. It's a question about the appropriate information system for research and policy. As we've heard Emily say that the input data was, you know, absolutely paramount for the science that can then inform policy, and we've heard Martin say that there's an appetite within government to have open data sort of fueling that system. And your example just now, Rhonda, about, you know, the requirement to have the right input data for science and then policy, and sometimes both of them at the same time. So given Aidan's fragmented diagram, what would be a way ahead to get some kind of coordination around the strategy, the infrastructure, the investments in that information system, so that we have a smart government and a smart research system that learns from itself, so that the outputs of the hospitals are just automatically plugged into the epidemiological research, or the environmental impact studies, or the science that's happening in the environment is just automatically part of our system by design, rather than by happenstance, which is probably, well, not happenstance, but perhaps separated investments and separated strategy and separated infrastructure for that baseload data and information.
Can I have a go at that first?
Yep.
Look, unfortunately, I think it's slow and incremental. I think the system is actually capable of learning and adapting and changing. And if you look at the bureaucracy now compared to what it was 20 years ago, it is actually very different. The practices are very different. The response to problems is different. So it has shown it can adapt. But it's difficult, because there is a degree of separation and isolation and fragmentation in the system. And I'm very, very wary of whole of government initiatives, because the diversity in the diagram that I showed is really very striking. I mean, what runs your department is very different from what runs even something quite related, which is industry or education or social services. So the notion that you could have a whole of government response to almost anything is almost fanciful. So the way to go forward is to chip at it a little bit at a time, present good models, and then good models get taken up. And the system does actually work that way. And it is, it might sound slow and depressing, and you're bashing your head against a brick wall, but I think it does adopt and adapt reasonably efficiently. I don't know if you...
I'd only say one thing. I'm a bit into you can't bung the whole of the government into one thing, because the drivers for what we do are entirely different. Good point. I think the thing that we can't underestimate, though, is how connecting people can help solve some of those problems. If I only knew sometimes what Martin had stashed away in their databases, I might give different policy advice. If my staff in plant biosecurity knew what CSIRO was working on right then and there, and what data they held, I might give different advice. It mightn't be wrong or completely different, but it might be enhanced. And it's actually people who bring creativity, and that's what policymakers want. They want creativity. So data actually has to feed creativity, and only people can do that. So I reckon there's a gap we've still yet to fill, and the gap is actually because we have no time. That if we could just hang out a bit more and understand, a bit more about what everybody's doing, we might actually understand what data and information could help the creative process. So I'm a bit of not a Luddite at all. I know what Tinder is now. Got kids. But I think that we sometimes put too much emphasis on the technology side and not enough emphasis on the technology with people. And I think we actually have to raise that dialogue a bit more.
We have another question here.
Françoise Bellandier, Department of Education and Training. I used to be a scientist in my former life. Thank you for the panels for really interesting presentations. I particularly enjoyed Rona's presentation, having worked in quarantine policy. Asking a scientist for a black and white answer puts them outside of their comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what, you were talking about training and getting them to think like how policymakers think. How do you address that, putting them outside of their comfort zone?
Asking a lawyer for a black and white answer is really not the dumb thing either, because I think scientists and lawyers do have something in common, and that's that they deal with hypotheses and risk. And what they do is apply knowledge and information to scenarios. They just do it in a really different way. And so I guess when I had my delegation of really brainy people who've got like long-standing, revered people, and told me, we don't want you here. What I did with them was an exercise. I took a whole bunch of shoes into the room. So dirty sneakers, footy boots, R.M. Williams boots, thongs, stilettos, and actually asked them to stand in a whole range of different shoes and actually think about, if you were going to tell the person wearing shoes like that your bit, how would you do it? Now, it was quite funny seeing some of these different people in different shoes, deliberately provocative, but it was the start of a dialogue between policy thinkers and scientists about both of them understanding and empathising with different kind of stuff. It's become like a little bit of a folklore in our department now. Oh no, here comes Rona in her shoes. But it actually does stimulate people to think differently if they actually have to think like the person that they're trying to advise. And it's a work in progress, and I think it always will be. I don't know if others want to contribute.
Good example.
No answers? Okay, Ross, we have time for Ross's question, and then I'll sum up.
Oh, we're stealing the last question again, but Katrina got away with it, so I'll have a go. One of the things I think's come out of this session that we haven't really experienced in the earlier sessions, and Rona really brought it up, and it's been referred to in the questions, is that we have scientists working in different segments within our society, and those scientists have to work at different time frames. So a scientist obviously working within your department has to respond to your time frame. They really don't have much of a choice. A lot of scientists work in industry and also have very short time frames, and expectations are very black and white answers that they're not comfortable with. In your experience, have you found that dealing with scientists from those different subsections or subcultures of science makes a difference to their responsiveness to that? And is there perhaps some benefit out of trying to get scientists to multi-experience, like you talked about scientists going in and out of government? Does that aid in their ability to give you that sort of response?
Wow. There's these guys that work behind the border, these entomologists that can like pick any bug. There's this guy who's like the mite expert of Australia, and his answer in real time is to squash it. It's like, you know, and yeah, you do get a very different response and consideration to a problem depending on the context in which they work. And as I said, I've seen scientists, brilliant people sit in front of ministers who are they just want to know for question time, can they say a nematode behaves like this or not, you know? And the guys that know their nematodes and they know their methyl bromide will sit there and say, well, no, if you've got it, he's like, I don't want to know that. Is it 1 millimetre or 3? I mean, it's really hard stuff. What I noticed is that those people that have got long-term research projects are way more relaxed. And really until about the 1st of June when they know whether funding's coming or not, and then you see them sort of running a bit faster. I actually think that we should make sure that the people who work in the sort of applied scientists and the operational scientists get a chance to go into the research side and vice versa, because I actually think the way they think can actually enhance a lot of what's going on. And look, we try to do a bit of that. You know, we were only talking in my department the other day about employment in the APS and how hard it is to recruit because of the way that the APS is designing that set of hurdles, which is not a complaint, it's just a reality. And why don't we look at graduate students to come in and do short-term pieces for us, you know, because we can, they'd like the money, I know they would, but they'd also like the experience on a decent piece of work. So could we look at mixes of in-house, out-of-house, that we outsource a lot, but somewhere in between. And that will also bridge the kind of different disciplines. And when I say disciplines, I don't mean the pathology versus biology, I actually mean the short-term operational versus longer-term research. I think we've got to do more of that, otherwise we also lose the enthusiasm and all they do is squash the bug.
Do we have others who'd like to respond?
Oh, I think it was a great answer.
Well, if we've actually run out of time, sorry. If there are further questions, please try and bug these guys. Oh, thank you. At afternoon tea. We only have 15 minutes for afternoon tea. I've heard a lot of really great stories today, also a lot of direct advice. Hope someone's writing it all down because someone needs to write a summary for us. Come and chat.